Europe is trapped in a relentless squeeze, pressed from every angle, forced into a corner where it must decide: protect its own autonomy or keep towing the US line, even if it means economic pain. Since Biden took office, Europe's moves have been puzzling, especially regarding China. They slapped tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles and solar panels, sending ripples through trade. Now, China has fired back, slapping sanctions on 2 European banks, barring them from operating in the world's largest Asian economy. These aren't Europe's biggest banks yet, but the message is loud and clear: escalate, and the consequences will hit harder. It all started when the EU sanctioned Chinese banks for dealing with Russia, and now the tit-for-tat cycle is accelerating. Europe faces a test: keep pushing forward or pull back. Some countries like Hungary and Spain want to mend fences with China, but broadly speaking, the US still holds a chokehold on Europe. Despite enduring Trump's brutal trade wars and tariffs, Europe hasn't broken free. Italy is a telling example. Its government is actively cutting Chinese investment in strategic sectors under the banner of de-risking. But in reality, this means losing crucial Chinese expertise and market access just when Europe's economy is shaky. Why is Italy doing this? Because they fear the US's reaction. Look at Pirelli, the Italian tire giant, more than a third owned by a Chinese company, which should open doors to China's market. Instead, they face hurdles in the US, like restrictions on supplying Formula One teams due to national security concerns over Chinese ownership. Now, any company with Chinese investors is seen as a security risk in Washington. This suspicion spreads into energy too. Italian energy firms are barred from US projects because of their Chinese ties. Even with the US raising tariffs and cutting funds, Europe is stuck, caught in a vice between dependence and pressure. And the story isn't just about China. Europe is also still deeply embroiled in the Russia conflict. The EU is prepping its 19th round of sanctions against Russia, but these moves raise the question: are they helping or just harming Europe? Russia's economy is holding up surprisingly well, bolstered by growing partnerships with China, India, and others. Meanwhile, Europe cut itself off from cheap Russian energy, spending billions with little to show for it. Europe's influence on the world stage is fading fast as the US steps up its leadership. Europe is sidelined from key talks like the Alaska Summit, while their economies take hits. Since 2022, German exports to China have tanked. Chinese firms are now producing their own auto parts and machinery, while European products become pricier and less competitive. Germany and other nations reliant on exports are stuck in limbo. China doesn't need European goods, but Europe desperately needs Chinese components to keep costs down. Plus, Europe must keep the US on side. They're stuck trying to satisfy both, and it's failing spectacularly. Europe's leverage has evaporated. Their trade deficit with China has doubled since 2020. Tariffs haven't stopped imports from outpacing exports. And when Europe cut ties with Russia, those resources flowed to China instead. Europe is now trying to pivot toward the US market, selling cars and aircraft parts, but even here, raw materials come from China. So, despite their best intentions, Europe can't simply walk away from China. The tangled global supply chain ensures dependency. The pressure keeps mounting. The US now openly demands full European commitment, support more sanctions, isolate Russia, crack down on China and India. The US Treasury Secretary practically runs European policy. It's a humiliating reality for Europe, but rejecting US demands risks brutal retaliation. Trump or someone like him could revive trade wars, doubling tariffs on European goods and devastating industries like Germany's car sector. Europe is caught in a vice with no escape. The US isn't just targeting rivals anymore. It's pressuring its own allies to join an aggressive campaign to isolate and weaken BRICS, the powerful bloc of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now growing. The excuse is BRICS countries continue buying Russian oil despite Western sanctions, but that's only the surface. The true goal is strategic: cripple BRICS' economic power by cutting them off from critical markets, starting with Europe. The US wants the EU to impose crushing tariffs on BRICS economies, especially China and India, effectively shutting them out of the European consumer base. And here lies the irony. Europe's economy simply isn't robust enough to play tough anymore. Across the continent, consumers are under significant pressure. Wages remain stagnant, inflation persists, and energy prices continue to fluctuate after the Ukraine conflict. While Americans are grappling with mounting debt, Europeans face even greater hardships. Their economies are exhibiting clear signs of prolonged weariness, and if Europe attempts to mimic the US's aggressive approach, it could push itself into deeper economic distress. The crucial point? Europe's supply chains are deeply intertwined with China and India, the key BRICS nations. From chemicals and electronics to pharmaceuticals, much of Europe's manufacturing depends on these countries. Attempting to penalize BRICS by severing trade means Europe would need to identify alternative sources for vital raw materials and components. That's a colossal and expensive challenge, not something resolved quickly. Europe's connections with BRICS run profound. Over 23% of EU trade is with BRICS plus countries, compared to just 16.7% for the US. That's a considerable difference, indicating Europe stands to lose far more if this relationship deteriorates. Meanwhile, BRICS nations are more diversified. Less than 15% of their trade relies on Europe, and under 10% is linked to the US. They have been steadily cultivating ties across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, providing them with numerous alternatives. The bottom line? Europe depends on BRICS more than BRICS depends on Europe. That's why this strategy is so. If the US and EU proceed with sanctions and trade restrictions, BRICS will retaliate. This backlash could take the form of higher tariffs on European goods, export limitations, or rerouting supply chains to friendlier markets. The result? Europe faces escalating costs for inputs, fewer buyers for its exports, and decelerated economic growth. It's like pulling bricks out of the wall supporting your own house. Collapse becomes inevitable. This isn't alarmism, it's straightforward economics. Europe exported nearly $450 billion worth of goods to BRICS countries last year and imported about $750 billion in return. These imports aren't luxuries. They're indispensable raw materials, rare earth elements, intermediate goods, and energy supplies. If those trade flows are interrupted, Europe can't just switch suppliers overnight, especially not at comparable prices. And Europe's domestic industries aren't prepared to fill those gaps. Many analysts caution that if Europe follows the US route, it won't just damage its economy. It could lock the continent deeper into reliance on American industry and financial backing. That's the opposite of the EU's declared goal of strategic autonomy. Rather than becoming more self-sufficient, Europe risks becoming more dependent on a partner increasingly focused on its own national priorities. At the same time, the US is intensifying the economic battle in the semiconductor sector. Donald Trump, a central figure in this push, is advocating tariffs on imported semiconductors rising from 100% to 300%. That's no mistake. A 300% tariff would make foreign-made chips 3 times more expensive for US buyers. The objective? The US aims to dominate the entire chip supply chain, not only design but also manufacturing and equipment. This includes major firms like TSMC in Taiwan, Samsung, and SK Hynix in South Korea, and equipment producers like ASML in the Netherlands and Tokyo Electron in Japan. Rather than creating new US-based chip manufacturers, which would require years and billions of dollars, Washington seeks to relocate existing global leaders to American soil using a combination of aggressive tariffs, political pressure, and massive subsidies funded by deficit spending and monetary expansion. But this plan is riddled with obstacles. If these companies refuse to relocate, American consumers and businesses will still need their chips, especially the advanced ones that only TSMC currently produces at scale. That means US buyers would bear the tariffs, causing prices to surge. Electronics would become costlier, and businesses dependent on cutting-edge chips, AI startups, defense contractors, biotech firms, would face increased costs and supply limitations. If chipmakers do move, problems persist. Building new fabrication plants, or fabs, takes years, and reaching full operational capacity takes even longer. Additionally, chip production in the US is considerably more expensive due to higher labor costs, materials, and regulatory requirements. So even domestically produced chips will likely be pricier and less efficient. It's not a guaranteed advantage. China naturally isn't passive. It controls a significant portion of the global supply of rare earth materials essential for chip production. If China restricts exports or enforces controls, it could strangle US chip manufacturing before it scales up. Simultaneously, China is ramping up its chip research and development spending, up 20% last year alone. Over the past 15 years, China's total R&D investment has multiplied fivefold, narrowing the gap with the US and creating viable alternatives to Western chips. So where does this leave us? The US seeks to reshape global trade and dominate key industries but lacks the natural resources, industrial depth, and time to execute smoothly. Europe is being drawn into this effort even though the impact on its economy could be severe. If both go too far, they risk isolating themselves from the very global markets they once led. This is about more than trade. It's a fundamental transformation of the global order. The old rules of globalization are being rewritten. Alliances are shifting. Power is moving east and south. The US and EU face a critical choice: adjust to this new reality or resist it with barriers, tariffs, and coercion. But if they choose resistance, they risk building walls that trap them inside, cutting off their access to the opportunities of a changing world.